This table should not exist. Its very design goes against everything we know about woodworking. It breaks so many fundamental rules about wood movement and grain direction that it should tear itself apart in under a year. Unless there is something more than what meets the eye. Maybe some hidden secret that the average person would never guess. Something so ingenious that rather than falling apart almost immediately, this table will still be good as new when your grandkids haul it out to the curb decades from now to make room for some mass-produced particle board piece of crap they saw on Pinterest. This is part 2 of a series in which I've been helping my friend and his now YouTube famous kids build an heirloom quality table using inexpensive construction lumber from Home Depot. How do you build quality furniture from garbage wood? You have to know a few tricks. And in part 1, I explained the trick to making a 2x4 tabletop that won't look like this a week after it's been glued up. If you haven't watched that video yet, you'll find a link pinned to the top of the comment section below. You really should check it out. Here in part 2, I'm going to explain how adding boards that run across the two ends of the tabletop will ensure that it lasts forever, even though, at least theoretically, this should destroy the entire table. Let me explain. Common sense tells us that dead things don't move unless you poke them with a stick. That's because even the death of a tree cannot stop wood movement. As the humidity increases, the fibers in the wood swell up. Boards grow wider and thicker. Then as the humidity decreases, these fibers contract. Boards shrink narrower and thinner. You can't stop it. It's just going to happen. Boards are constantly changing in thickness and width, but they are not changing in length. They don't grow longer and they don't shrink shorter. So what happens if you attach one board across the ends of others like you see on this tabletop? Theoretically, the end board would interfere with the other boards as they try to expand and contract, and in time they would crack and split and the tabletop would fail because you broke a fundamental rule of woodworking. Do not cross wood grain. So why doesn't the breadboard ends on a table like this cause a catastrophic failure? Because inside is a clever system of mortises, tenons, grooves, tongues, and pins that keep the top from warping but still allow it to change in width as the wood naturally moves. Here's a drawing of what's going on inside. We have a tongue that runs the entire width of the table end and a groove inside the mating breadboard. We also have a series of 5 tenons extending from the tongue. These fit into mortises that are cut deeply into the breadboard end. Each mortise is slightly wider than the tenons that fit in them, and there's also some extra room at each end of the groove. This allows the tongue and the tenons to move side to side as the table expands and contracts in width. Of course, that means the breadboard is not held on with glue. Instead, pins are driven through each tenon location using elongated holes and strategically applied glue. Now you could be wondering, why not just use a simple tongue and groove joint and skip the longer tenons and the deeper mortises? It's about strength. Someday someone is going to grab the end of your table and try to lift it. And when they do, you'll be glad there is more than just a short tongue connecting that end. The longer tenons go deeper into the breadboard for a stronger connection. Ideally, you want those tenons to extend at least halfway into the breadboard's width. The need for strength is also why the end of the table is cut into separate tenons rather than using a single extra long tongue and groove. The shallow groove, combined with a few deeper mortises, leaves more material in the breadboard itself, which makes it much stronger. It's a more complex joint, but the old-timers who came up with this technology knew what they were doing. So let me share with you how it's made. I'm using the longest half-inch router bit I own. It's 4 inches from end to end, but I lose some of that length because I want it to be fully secure within the collet. I can get about 2.5 inches of cutting depth if I stretch it, but I wouldn't go more than that. The bit I'm using is from Whiteside, and it has an upcut spiral design. This helps pull the chips up and out of the mortise while I work, which keeps it cooler and extends the bit life. If you invest in a good bit for a project like this, you'll find many other uses for it down the road. I'll put a link to the one I use below the video. I'm also using an edge guide with 2 fences. This is actually one of my favorite edge guides for a lot of reasons. It does a whole bunch of things, but the double fences really come in handy for this sort of work. It's from Empower, and I'll tell you a bit more about it at the end of the video. It's well worth sticking around to see it. I set my bit to cut down the center of the workpiece. I have a trick to make sure that this is exact, which you'll see shortly. But I start with a relatively shallow cut, about 1/4 inch. It's far better to reduce the stress on the bit by making several shallow passes rather than try to cut full depth all at once. If you feel the bit vibrating, you're working it too hard. You might even cause it to come loose from the collet. Patience is the key to good woodworking. When I get to the end, I reverse the router and I cut back in the opposite direction. This will ensure that the groove is perfectly centered. Yes, it may also widen it a bit, but we'll cut the tongue and tenons to fit so it won't matter. After a few passes, the groove will be about 1 inch deep, and that's where I stop. Time to make the deep mortises. I lay them out with a pencil on both breadboards. I like to center one of the tenons, then add 2 more on each side. There's a good reason for that, but for the moment I'll leave you in suspense. As you cut the mortises, you might repeat the strategy of making several shallow passes for each mortise, working up to your full depth. But that does tend to get a little boring. So here's an alternative. I'm making several full depth plunges, essentially boring a series of overlapping holes in a straight line. This removes the bulk of the material. Then, when I reach the end of the mortise, I can clean out what remains with a full depth pass without putting too much side load on the router bit. Of course, I also make a final pass in the reverse direction to ensure it too is centered. Once I've cut all 5 mortises in each breadboard, I can measure their depth and transfer that to the end of the tabletop. In fact, I'm measuring slightly less than that depth from the distance of the end of the table because I want to make sure my tenons don't bottom out in the mortises. Because I want to be sure I get a nice, crisp shoulder without any tear out from the router, I'm using a straight edge and a knife to sever the wood fibers along my pencil line. I do the same with the edge fibers. There's no need to do it on the underside of the tabletop because that won't be visible. I've set my router's depth of cut carefully to the thickness of the walls beside my groove on the breadboard end. Then an edge guide is used to make the first pass along the pencil line. The next pass will be freehand, widening the first, and so on, working my way toward the end of the tabletop. This leaves just a little strip of wood in place to help balance the router right up until the final pass. While it is harder to keep the router from tipping a little bit as you finish up, it won't really matter at the very end of these tenons. The same process is repeated on both sides of both ends of the tabletop, creating a long tongue on each end that now has to be divided up into tenons. Here I'm laying out their locations by eye using my breadboard as a reference. Remember, each tenon should be about 1/4 inch narrower on each side of each mortise. Don't forget to mark off the inch that will stay in place for the tongue, and it's a good idea to color in the waist area so you don't accidentally cut in the wrong place. You can cut these by hand, but I think it's just simpler to use the router. The offset base on this one makes it easier to support as I work. I'm not looking for perfection here. The thickness of the tenons mattered a lot more than their width. Just hog out the waist and call it good. A chisel can then be used to square up the corners that the round bit couldn't get into. A chisel can also be used to round over the edges of the tenons so they at least slightly match the radius created on the end of each mortise by your router bit. The breadboard should slip on relatively easily. Don't pound it to death with a mallet. If more than just a few taps are required, make some adjustments. My favorite tool for this is a coarse sanding block. This one is carbide from a company called Duragrit. You've seen me use them before. They're fantastically useful. If you want one, I'll link to it below. Other than not wanting to split the breadboard, the reason you don't want to just pound it on is because you'll have to take it off again after this next step. I lay out the locations for a series of 1/2 inch holes. One hole goes through each mortise and the tenon inside. I want to use a good sharp Forstner bit for this step so I don't risk tearing up the surface fibers. I'll also be drilling from the top surface down because the cleanest hole will always be on the entrance, not the exit. I'm sure you've seen this Miles Craft drilling rig in my videos before. It's incredibly handy for jobs like this. It's funny how you get a tool and then you wonder how you ever got by without it before. This is one of those tools. Do yourself a favor and get one. I'll link to it below the video. After boring the holes, the breadboard comes back off. Then a file or a rasp is used to elongate most of the holes so the dowels will move freely from side to side, but not front to back. You're making ovals, not just making them larger. I also said to do this to most of the holes. You're going to skip the hole in the center tenon. Don't elongate that one on either end of the tabletop. It's possible that your top has cupped a small amount since you put it together, so we're using something straight to clamp it flat to the bench top, and that'll help the breadboard slip on easier. And the moment of truth has arrived. I love it when a seam closes up nice and tight. Now about that glue. We want some just inside the rim of the holes in the surface of the breadboard, but not down inside the tenon itself. So the pegs are left dry as they're driven partway in, then a little glue is added before driving them deeper. The goal is to keep it from falling out of the hole someday while allowing the tenon inside to still move freely. The pegs were cut extra long and they extend all the way through and out the bottom below. When the glue is dry, they can be flush cut with the surfaces. The exception is the middle hole. That peg should be fully glued in to keep the breadboard centered on the end of the table. Expansion and contraction will then be from the center outward toward the edges. Because of the width of the table will change seasonally, while the length of the breadboard will not, I like to leave a bit of extra length at each corner. Now it looks like a design feature instead of an uneven fit. By the way, you're looking at the underside of the table. There just wasn't a need to fuss over a tight seam here. That's how you make breadboard ends. They look great, they keep the table flat, and who would guess that this was made from construction lumber? The base presented its own challenges though. Leave me a comment below if you'd like a final video about those angled half-lap joints. I can't give you plans for the table because I didn't design it, but I can tell you about this. This is the CRB7 router jig system from Empower Tools, and it does just about everything with amazing accuracy due to its clever micro adjuster. It's just one of the many product innovations from this small family-owned company. You gotta check them out at the link in the notes below this video.